I didn't run away. I ran to him.
At 4:47 p.m., the bride was gone. Not late. Not hiding somewhere for a quiet moment. Gone. In a way that no one could explain. Not even hours later, when the panic had fully set in. Her shoes were still in the dressing room. Her phone was found face down on the floor, screen cracked. And on the windowsill, someone found a piece of her veil, torn. Not cut, like it had caught on something as she left. No one saw her walk out. No one heard a car. One moment, she was getting ready for the biggest day of her life. The next, she simply wasn't there. What her family found 3 days later would change the way everyone remembered that wedding, including the people who thought they knew her best. Her name was Claire Bennett. She was 29 years old, the kind of woman people described as warm before they described her as anything else. She remembered birthdays without being reminded. She noticed when someone in a room had gone quiet and would find a way to sit beside them without making it a moment. Friends say she laughed easily and cried at commercials. She grew up in a modest house outside Asheville, North Carolina, the middle child of 3, raised by a mother who worked double shifts, and a father who left when Claire was 7 and never came back. Maybe that was why Claire held on to the people she loved so tightly once she found them. She wasn't the type to disappear on anyone. That is what made everything that followed so difficult for the people closest to her to accept. She met Daniel Whitfield at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, a party neither of them had wanted to attend. Claire almost left before dessert. If she had, none of what came next might have happened at all. Instead, she stayed for one more drink, and Daniel made her laugh so hard she nearly knocked over a glass of wine. They talked until the restaurant staff started stacking chairs around them. 4 years later, Daniel proposed on an ordinary Tuesday evening. No crowd, no elaborate setup, just the two of them on her apartment balcony, with the city lights behind him. Claire said yes before he even finished the question. Those who knew them both agree that, whatever happened on that wedding day, it did not begin with Daniel. It began somewhere else. Somewhere none of them had thought to look. Planning the wedding took just over a year. Claire wanted something small, something real, nothing that felt like a performance for people she barely spoke to. They chose a quiet countryside venue 2 hours outside the city, surrounded by fields and old oak trees, the kind of place where the only sound most mornings was birdsong. Guest list, under 60 people. Family, a handful of close friends, nothing more. Claire had been firm about that from the beginning. She did not want a spectacle. She wanted the people she loved most gathered in one room, on one day, and nothing else mattered to her beyond that. It is worth remembering how ordinary that morning felt to everyone who was there, because ordinary mornings are rarely the ones people expect to end in tragedy. The morning of the wedding began the way countless mornings before it had. Claire woke early, made coffee, and sat with her sister Emily on the back porch of the guest house where the bridal party had stayed the night before. They laughed about how nervous Daniel had sounded on the phone the night before, his voice cracking twice while trying to say something sentimental. Nothing about that morning suggested anything was wrong. The hairdresser arrived on schedule. The florist arrived early. Claire's mother cried the good kind of tears while helping her into the first of 2 dresses. If you had walked into that guest house at 10 in the morning, you would have seen nothing except a woman preparing for the happiest day she had been planning for over a year. But there were small things. Things that, at the time, meant nothing to anyone standing close enough to notice them. At around 1:40 in the afternoon, while Claire sat in the chair getting her hair finished, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, stood up without a word, and stepped outside to take the call. The hairdresser later said, Claire was gone for nearly 6 minutes, far longer than a quick hello, and when she came back inside, something about her had changed. She was quieter. Her smile did not quite reach the same place it had before. When Emily asked who had called, Claire said simply, an old friend, and changed the subject before anyone could ask another question. No one pressed her. It was her wedding day. People assumed nerves, or an old friend calling to wish her well. Nothing more than that. Then there was the guest no one recognized. During setup that afternoon, Claire's mother noticed a man standing near the edge of the property, close to where the ceremony would take place, dressed for the occasion, but unfamiliar to every member of the family she asked. When she mentioned him to one of the wedding coordinators, she was told he had introduced himself as a friend of the bride and had been let through without issue. Weddings are full of unfamiliar faces, people from a couple's separate histories meeting for the first time, so no one thought to question it further. He was seen once more, briefly, standing near the tree line during the early part of the reception setup, and then he was gone before anyone thought to ask his name. And then there was the comment. As Claire and Emily sat together finishing the last touches before the ceremony, Emily joked about how nervous Claire must be feeling, teasing her the way sisters do. Claire smiled, but it was a smile that did not quite match her eyes, and she said, "You have no idea." Emily laughed it off at the time, assuming ordinary bridal nerves, the kind every woman feels standing an hour away from changing her entire life. It was only weeks later, replaying that moment over and over in her mind, that Emily began to wonder if her sister had been trying to tell her something in that instant, something she did not yet have the words to say out loud. At 3:15 in the afternoon, with the ceremony less than an hour away, Claire excused herself to the dressing room to finish getting ready alone. Her mother offered to come with her, the way mothers do on days like this one, wanting to hold on to every last minute before handing their daughter to someone else. Claire told her she only needed a few minutes to breathe, to gather herself before walking down the aisle. Her mother kissed her forehead and left the room, closing the door gently behind her. It was 3:15 in the afternoon. It was the last time anyone in that family would see Claire Bennett as the woman they had known for 29 years. By 4 in the afternoon, when Claire had not returned from the dressing room, her mother knocked gently on the door, expecting to find her daughter finishing her makeup or steadying her nerves in front of the mirror. There was no answer. When she opened the door, the room was empty. Claire's shoes sat neatly beside the chair where she had last been seen. Her phone lay face down on the floor near the window, its screen cracked, as though it had been dropped rather than set down. On the windowsill, caught on the latch, was a torn piece of her veil, ragged at the edge in a way that suggested it had snagged on something, as someone climbed through rather than walked out the door. Her mother called her name twice before the fear in her voice reached the hallway and brought the rest of the family running. Within 20 minutes, what had been a wedding preparing to begin became a search. Guests who had arrived early for the ceremony were asked to wait in the reception hall while the wedding party checked every room of the guest house, every corner of the property, the barn where the reception tables had been set, the tree line at the edge of the field. Daniel searched the grounds himself, calling Claire's name until his voice gave out, refusing every suggestion that he sit down and let others look. Emily kept dialing Claire's number, knowing full well the phone was lying cracked on the dressing room floor, unable to stop herself from trying anyway. By 5 o'clock, with no sign of her anywhere on the property, someone finally called the police. The officers who arrived treated it, at first, the way most departments treat a missing bride on her wedding day, as someone who had likely gotten cold feet and left on her own. They asked about arguments, about doubts Claire might have expressed in the days before the ceremony, about any history of anxiety or hesitation regarding the marriage. Daniel insisted there had been nothing. No fight, no doubt. Nothing that would explain her running from her own wedding without a word to anyone. Emily remembered the phone call from earlier that afternoon and the 6 minutes Claire had disappeared to take it, and for the first time began to wonder if that call had something to do with everything that followed. Word spread through the guests gathered in the reception hall, and the mood shifted from confusion to something closer to dread. Some had seen the unfamiliar man near the tree line earlier that day, and now his presence took on a different weight. Claire's mother described him to the officers as best she could, a man in his 60s perhaps, gray at the temples, dressed appropriately for a wedding, but recognized by no one in the family. The coordinator confirmed he had introduced himself only as a friend of the bride, before slipping past the entrance without a name being recorded anywhere. No one had seen him leave. No one had seen him speak to Claire directly, but the timing, arriving before the ceremony and vanishing sometime before the search began, was impossible for anyone to ignore. That night, with no leads and no sign of Claire anywhere near the venue, theories began to take shape among family, guests, and eventually the small community that had heard the news. The first theory, favored quietly by the police in the early hours, was that Claire had simply changed her mind. People do, even at the final hour. Even after a year of planning, and the torn veil and cracked phone could be explained by panic rather than force. A woman climbing out a window in a hurry to escape a life she had suddenly decided was not hers to live. Those who knew her best rejected this immediately. Claire was not someone who ran from difficult conversations. If she had doubts, her family insisted, she would have said so, even at the cost of embarrassment, rather than vanish without a word to the people who loved her most. The second theory grew heavier as the hours passed. The possibility that the unfamiliar guest had taken her against her will, that the torn veil and dropped phone were signs of a struggle, rather than a hurried exit. This theory gained traction quickly among the guests, fueled by fear and the absence of any better explanation, and by morning, it had reached local news outlets eager for a story with this much emotional weight. Investigators began pulling security footage from a gas station a mile from the venue, footage that showed almost nothing useful. A blurred sedan passing through frame at roughly the right time, its plate unreadable, its driver impossible to identify. It was enough to keep the theory alive without confirming anything at all. The third theory, quieter and slower to surface, involved Daniel himself, or more specifically, his family's finances. Rumors began circulating among distant relatives that Daniel's father had recently taken on significant debt through a failed business venture, and that pressure from creditors had reportedly reached Daniel in the weeks before the wedding. Some wondered, cruelly and without evidence, whether Claire had learned something about the family she was marrying into and had chosen to disappear rather than confront it directly. Daniel, already exhausted from a sleepless night of searching, learned of this rumor from a cousin who repeated it without thinking, and for the first time since Claire had vanished, those closest to him watched him break down entirely, not from grief alone, but from the added weight of being suspected by people who had known him his whole life. For 2 full days, the search continued without a single confirmed sighting of Claire anywhere. Police canvassed the surrounding roads, spoke to neighboring farms, and reviewed every piece of footage within a 10-mile radius of the venue, finding nothing that placed her definitively anywhere after 3:15 that afternoon. Emily, unable to sit still, began going through Claire's belongings at the guest house, searching for anything that might explain the phone call or the identity of the man at the tree line. Tucked inside a small jewelry box, beneath a pair of earrings Claire had chosen for the ceremony, Emily found a folded note in her sister's handwriting, addressed simply to her, dated the night before the wedding, and left there as though Claire had known, even then, that she might need to explain herself to someone eventually. The note did not mention Daniel, did not mention doubts about the wedding, and did not read as a goodbye in the way everyone had feared. It spoke instead of their father, Robert, the man who had left when Claire was 7 years old, and had not been part of either of their lives since. Claire wrote that she had recently learned, through a family friend she had reconnected with online months earlier, that Robert was dying, and that he had asked, through this friend, for the chance to see her one final time before he passed. She wrote that she had not told anyone, not even Daniel, because she did not know how to explain wanting to see the man who had abandoned them, without reopening wounds she had spent years trying to close for good. Emily brought the note to the police within the hour, and for the first time, the investigation had a direction that did not involve suspicion or fear, but something closer to grief. Officers quickly identified the family friend Claire had mentioned only by first name in the note, a man named Walter Reyes, a former neighbor from their childhood who had remained close with Robert over the years despite losing touch with the rest of the family. Walter's phone records showed a call placed to Claire's cell phone at 1:41 that afternoon, lasting just under 6 minutes, precisely the length of time she had stepped outside during her hair appointment. It was Walter who had been seen near the tree line, waiting, exactly as Claire had apparently asked him to. What the note could not explain was where Claire and Walter had gone, or why, more than 2 full days later, neither of them could be reached by phone, or found at any address connected to either name. Robert's listed residence, a modest home 2 hours from the venue, in the opposite direction from Claire's childhood town, turned up nothing when officers arrived, only a hospice nurse, who confirmed that Robert had been moved to a regional medical facility nearly a week earlier as his condition worsened, and that she had not seen Walter or anyone matching Claire's description since. For a brief and agonizing period, the investigation stalled entirely, caught between a note that explained motive without confirming location, and a family growing more desperate by the hour for any sign of where their daughter had gone. The break came on the 3rd day, not through the police directly, but through a call placed to the regional hospital nearest the medical facility where Robert had been transferred. A woman matching Claire's description had been brought in by ambulance the same evening she disappeared, found unconscious near a stretch of rural highway after a single vehicle accident involving a sedan that had swerved to avoid a deer and struck a tree at considerable speed. She had been carrying no identification, her purse left behind at the guest house in her hurry to leave, and had remained in stable but unconscious condition for nearly 3 full days, while hospital staff attempted, without success, to determine who she was. It was only when a nurse recognized a photo circulating on local news that the connection was finally made. and Claire's family was notified within the hour. Walter Reyes had not been driving the car that night. He had arranged to meet Claire near the tree line and drive her to the hospital himself, but Claire, anxious and unwilling to wait even the short time it would take him to bring his car around, had taken his keys and insisted on driving herself while he gathered his coat from inside the house, wanting desperately to reach her father before it was too late. Walter had followed on foot toward the road only moments after, arriving just in time to see the accident from a distance, too far to prevent it, close enough to call for help immediately. He had stayed with her until the ambulance arrived, then quietly stepped away before officers could ask him anything, afraid of how the situation might look. An unfamiliar older man standing over an unconscious bride on a rural roadside at dusk. When Claire woke, 2 days after the accident, the first thing she asked for was not Daniel, not her mother, but whether her father was still alive. He was, though barely, and within hours of regaining consciousness, still bruised and disoriented. Claire insisted on being taken to see him, despite the protests of every doctor in the room. What passed between Claire and Robert in those final visits before he died 3 days later was never something she chose to share in detail with anyone, not even Emily, but those who saw her afterward said she looked, for the first time in years, like someone who had finally set down something impossibly heavy that she had been carrying alone for far too long. Daniel was at her bedside within the hour of learning where she had been found, and whatever fear or anger he might have carried through those 3 unbearable days dissolved the moment he saw her open her eyes. He did not ask why she had not told him about her father, not that day, not for weeks afterward, understanding instinctively that some grief is too complicated to explain in the middle of planning a wedding, especially grief tied to a man who had caused so much pain simply by leaving. Claire later admitted she had been afraid that telling Daniel would somehow make the day about her father instead of about them, and that she had wanted, foolishly perhaps, to protect the wedding from a sadness she was not yet ready to carry into it. The wedding that had been interrupted so abruptly never happened the way either of them had originally planned it. 6 weeks later, once Claire had recovered enough to stand without assistance, she and Daniel were married in a small private ceremony in her mother's backyard, with only Emily, her mother, and Walter Reyes present as witnesses. There was no elaborate venue, no 60 guests. None of the details Claire had spent over a year arranging. There was only the ceremony itself, quiet and unremarkable to anyone passing by, and to Claire, exactly the day she needed after everything that had happened. She kept the torn piece of veil from that first attempted wedding day in a small frame on her dresser, not as a reminder of what went wrong, but of the father she had finally been able to say goodbye to before it was too late. To this day, the story of the bride who disappeared remains something the small community near that countryside venue still talks about, though most versions leave out the reasons entirely, remembering only the panic, the search, and the mystery of the unfamiliar guest who vanished without explanation. Claire has never minded the gaps in the story others tell. What matters to her, she has said, is not what strangers believe happened that day, but what actually did, and the fact that despite everything, despite the accident, the fear, and the 3 unbearable days her family spent not knowing if she was alive, she got the one thing she left to find, a final chance to say goodbye to her father, and the chance to come home to a life she still chose, in the end, to build with Daniel. If you're still watching, let us know in the comments what you would have done in Claire's position, and which theory you believed before you learned the truth. Stories like this one remind us how much can be happening beneath the surface of a single ordinary day, and how rarely the full picture is the one everyone assumes at first. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one, because there are far more stories like this one still waiting to be told. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.